Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors and contributors of Strategy Page discuss current events and other military-related topics with a splash of history. I'm your host, Dan Masterson. Joining us today is Jim Dunnigan, editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author, and acknowledged pioneer and innovator in board war games. Also joining us today is Austin Bay, associate editor of Strategy Page, military author, columnist, and retired Colonel, U.S. Army Reserves. Austin, you mentioned in an email to me that artillery has returned as the god of war. Artillery is the god of war is a statement attributed to Stalin, which is interesting that you quoted it. So what do you mean artillery has returned as the god of war?
Well, first of all, firepower is really the god of war. It's just that, yes, I was riffing off of Stalin, and we've got a minor contemporary renaissance of Stalin with Putin launching a conventional war against Ukraine. But I'll give you a personal anecdote, Dan, that I think actually will describe something that was a process or a trend within militaries. There's never been a relaxation or stoppage in trying to improve artillery. Everybody that compounder knows what artillery can do to you and for you. It ticks off the Air Force to be called another form of artillery, but in some ways, that's what bombs are. And putting bombs on target, close air support is a type of close up firepower support. So even though the Air Force doesn't like it, the thing is it's a bomb. It's an artillery piece. And bomb used to be a name for a shell as well. But in 2004, when I was on active duty with Multinational Corps Iraq, I went on a couple of ground patrols, but one with a dismounted artillery battery from 1st Cavalry Division, and they were operating as infantry. They had 6 of their 18 guns there, and they were operational. They had actually 2 of them not all that far from headquarters at a palace that they would use to fire against mortar positions or rocket positions that were firing at the base camp at Camp Victory. But to utilize the personnel, they were operating as infantry. And what are we to do as artillerymen? That was not a direct question asked of me by any of the artillerymen in that particular case. But that was, we're supposed to engage enemy artillery, enemy targets, and provide 24-hour fire support for the infantry and armor and combat engineers in the maneuver forces. Well, what I meant, Dan, is that in Ukraine you were seeing what some commentators were calling the return of artillery. It's World War I again, because you could see entrenched forces facing one another and lots of artillery exchanges. They seem to have forgotten about what happened in the Iran-Iraq war with Saddam's forces taking on the Ayatollah Khomeini's. Tons of artillery with that. Unguided, quote unquote, artillery. In other words, old time artillery. Not that it really was old time, but it didn't have smart shells with the GPS or other. I'm talking about the Iranians and Iraqis. Fancy types of guidance. Some extended range. There was a type of extended range gun with a base bleed ammunition, 155, that the Iraqis acquired from South Africa. But those were all kind of nuances that you only know about from reading things like strategy page. As even though strategy page didn't exist, Monorock War, that's the kind of thing that Jim Dunnigan and Austin Bay read to stay up on military weapons issues. But in Ukraine, you have a different situation, particularly by the Ukrainians. And I'd be interested in hearing Jim respond to this, in part because he wrote an excellent piece in last fall, forget when, on lessons learned in Ukraine, about how the Ukrainians had used the time with the slow war in the Donbass after the Russians seized Crimea and annexed it to figure out what do we do if we move to a intense, more intense, all-out conventional war with the Russians. And they started employing more than other nations, or let's put it this way, with more earnestness than other nations, using drones to coordinate artillery fire, find targets, because they were short of air assets, and given that Russia had surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery defending its militia forces, it's really its forces fighting in the Donbass. Now, that's the slow war, where they're learning how to use these surveillance and fire coordination sensor systems, if you want. This is what they are, sensor for the artillery. I've wondered about this, and I'm going to show you how a little speculation. Now, the Israelis have done that. Yes, the U.S. has done that. You suspect that they were getting advice from another country that's done it, Great Britain. And not suspect, I read that in 2015, 2016. But also Finland. Finland has done a lot on its own to prepare the way that they thought they were going to need to fight the Russians, creating artillery kill zones with longer range, and I'm talking of in excess of 42 kilometers, firing a 155 millimeter shell. Jim can talk more about that when we get into extended range munitions, but that's one part of the renaissance of artillery. Dan, longer and longer ranges and smarter shells. But the Finnish defense plans, which were always prototypes, at least what you'd see in the press, are similar to, you could, if you went and looked at a map of the Finnish-Russian border area, which I did, you could see what they were planning on doing. If the Russians came in, they weren't just going to be fighting small units equipped with anti-tank weapons and highly mobile in these Finnish ground defense units. They were going to have all of these longer range guns that were also highly mobile, some of them on truck mounted. Now I'm talking about like the US M109 howitzer series, which is an armored howitzer, but on trucks, so that they would be able to fire one or two shells very quickly and move. And they had selected alternative firing positions within. They knew where they were going to be going, or where they could go, based on and what they knew about Russian counterfires, and what they would figure out about the Russians being able to spot them. So there's work that's been done there theoretically and training. I mean, the Finns trained to do this, and the Ukrainians prepared to do it. But the key to it, I mean, the ground forces are there taking direct close combat on it, but was to take advantage of a long range gun with a smart shell, or a knowledge of where, once the reconnaissance element, the drone or ground, whatever, had identified the Russian target, and then hit it quickly with not one or two shells, but 15 shells. In other words, decimated, be an airstrike, more than 15 15 if they had the ammunition. In other words, it's a form of, I thought of it as a form of time on target, which is something that comes out of Fort Sill, Oklahoma in the late 20s and 30s. It doesn't get its name till World War II, but that is maneuvering fires across the battlefield by artillery from a fire direction center, so that essentially you're not just bringing one battery, you could bring as many battalions of artillery within range, and all the rounds arriving near simultaneously. Both surprise and also shock, not just explosive power, but seismic shock, and the like. That's was one of the America's ace cards in World War II. Now everybody wants to be able to do it. It looks like the Ukrainians can. The Russians have ended up lining their artillery up, and this was the return of their god, Stalin's god, lining it up hub to hub and just trying to shell heck out of the Ukrainians. It's definitely not as effective as Indians have been doing. So, Dan, my overly dramatic title, Return of the God of War. The God of War never left, but you've seen some advances that are very interesting. The Ukrainians have taken advantage of the artillery's mobilities, being able to link to advanced sensors, also figure out how to coordinate multiple guns to take on the same target. And I'm not even bringing in HIMARS and very smart long-range rockets, which multiple launch rocket system, the United States, U.S. Army weapon that we've written about a lot on strategy page. We've talked about HIMARS, and HIMARS actually managed to get into the headlines of mainstream media. That's been part of the revival and of artillery on the battlefield. I'm going to let Jim take off at some point on extended range munitions, but we've got a 155 shell and extended range that has a sabot. It's a sabot shell that can be fired by a 155 of a certain type, and the range on this shell is over 100 kilometers, 110, I think. I read in a strategy page article, and so you've got a system that can really take on deeper targets, and threaten it without exposing aircraft, a manned aircraft, definitely. And that brings the artillery back to being a premium system on the battlefield.
So, Jim, what's your view on the God returning?
Well, all what Austin said is accurate, but another thing that's come into play is the amount of ammunition each side needs in order to maintain their situation on the battlefield. Basically, both sides underestimated the amount of ammunition they would need. The Russians underestimated because they thought it would be a quick war. So they didn't really concern themselves too much how much ammunition they had in reserve. Well, that is now an issue, and they've run out, or pretty much. I mean, they're down to, dribs and drabs. And as Austin pointed out, the Ukrainians were much more smart in using their artillery. But the thing is, in a conventional peer-to-peer war where two sides are relatively equal, there's a lot of things you can do with artillery on the battlefield that require a fair amount of ammunition. For example, there's interdiction fire. If you want to prevent the enemy from using a supply route, you simply have to fire, a certain number of rounds at random intervals at that road, as it were, keep it under some observation, and basically deny that route to the enemy. There's also the ever popular suppression fire. If you want to keep the enemy from moving or make it very expensive to advance, you basically suppress them. A lot of ammunition has been used for that. That is basically what's holding the Russians back in Donbass, in Bakhmut, this place where they've been losing 10, 20,000 men, trying to advance, and now they've apparently abandoned it. There are different stories about what happened. Apparently, one unit broke. I mean, that's unusual, and they simply fled, and the Ukrainians simply marched right in, and game over. So the Russians are basically facing not only ammunition supply problems, but morale problems. And the Ukrainians are basically using their artillery advantage, not just in GMLRS and other long-range weapons they're receiving, but also in artillery. And they're making life very unpleasant. Now, that may become crucial if they try to advance. They'll be talking about their coming offensive. I think they're just waiting for more, Western tanks to arrive. There are quite a few coming. They only have about 40 or 50 right now, but they could have 100 in a few months, including some European nations are sending about 100 Leopard 1 tanks. Now, the Leopard 1 A5s are, they're not as heavy as the Leopard 2s, but they're adequate. They're adequate for the Russians. The Russians haven't got anything to do with the Leopard 2. And they can't really, do anything about, a 50 or 60 or 70, Leopard 1s coming at them. So, the Russians are in bad shape. The artillery doesn't stop armor advancing, but it can basically interfere with their advance. Like I say, a lucky shot, even if you're using barrage fire, a lucky shot will basically damage the running gear of tanks and basically make them immobile. And that's almost as good as destroying them if they have to advance in order to achieve anything. The Ukrainians have been using their suppression fire and interdiction fire very smartly, and it's been making life very difficult for the Russians. The Russians have always had supply problems because the Ukrainians have also used their GMLRS rockets to hit supply concentrations. Now, there was a story that came and went, thankfully, that the Russians had figured out a way to jam the GMLRS. Well, you really can't jam the GMLRS. You might be able to disrupt the GPS, although the GMLRS GPS is hardened, as it were, to countermeasures. But the INS, the inertial guidance system, is unjammable. It doesn't use any external signals. Now, it's not as accurate as the GPS, but it's still accurate enough. It'll land within 10 meters. That's 30 feet of the target instead of a few meters with GPS. And if you're using barrage fire, that's you're immune to jamming as well. So the Russians apparently didn't have any really effective jamming against the missiles, much less anything else. Or if they did, it got wiped out. So they, for all their faith they put in artillery, are at an artillery disadvantage now. Again, largely because they underestimated how much artillery ammunition they would require. They got a large supply from North Korea, and of course, at the same time, South Korea was sending us even as many, or if not more, 155 millimeter shells. So the Ukrainians would like more, but as long as they have an advantage over the Russians, that gives them a real edge. And that's what's happening. Again, conventional war, artillery is king again. He who has the most of it, ammunition more than anything else, is going to be able to dominate the battlefield. And that's exactly what's happening. And the Ukrainians are using that to pave the way for their offensive in the south. I don't know if they're going to try and use it for clearing minefields. One of the biggest problems they have out there is the minefields. But the thing is, the Russians couldn't put minefields and tank obstacles everywhere. And so the Ukrainians can basically thread their way through the gaps in those defensive lines and still get at the Russians. So we'll see that all played out in the next few months because the dry weather has arrived. It's good terrain for tanks, and the Russians are particularly weak. I mean, the most of the troops they have in Ukraine don't want to be there. The Ukrainians do want to be there. They're defending their homeland, And that's another enormous advantage that's hard to quantify, but it is significant. And so with the artillery, the mobility, the superior tank force, and more ammunition, the Ukrainians are going to be, a formidable force for the Russians to stop. And I don't think the Russians can stop it. They're already failing in stopping, minor attacks. And a major attack is nothing more than, dozens of minor attacks, done in some sort of synchronicity.
Austin, why have the Russians failed to use their artillery effectively?
That is a very good question, Dan. You could also ask me, why have they failed to use their Air Force effectively? And in another way is you could ask me, why have they failed to use their armored forces effectively? One of the answers that I think you'll find if you go through the strategy page reports is corruption. The poor quality ammunition, or quality equipment that hasn't been maintained. Now, I'm giving you an indirect answer or a deep answer, I guess. But the Russian forces, and I admit that I thought that they had improved when they went to decide to professionalize their forces. I wasn't the only defense analyst, defense writer that thought so, because you'd seen observers of Russian military training exercises and the like, but it didn't stick. The leadership was still top down. Now that's something I've written about. Jim's written about it. We've talked about it. From the Russians, it's going to come from the top, and you're going to carry it out this way. And what that does, especially with the kind of organizational pressure that comes from a dictatorship, is create a yes man syndrome. Yeah, everything's okay. Everything looks good, except it's all shoe polish and no shoe is one way it's been described. Russians, and when I say that, they know what's going on with the artillery development. I mentioned Finland. They spy on Finland constantly because Finns worry them. They still think Finland belongs to Russia, of course. They know what goes on in the United States. They've seen what the U.S. has done with the advanced shell. They also with the guided multiple launch rocket system could do. They spy on us, or they observe our exercises. But when their special operation failed so miserably down in the first 10 to 12 days, they started relying on, mass firepower. That's something they can still do. They did that in World War II. That's the hub-to-hub artillery pieces, just firing barrage after barrage after barrage. But here's what it did. That becomes a target opportunity for the Ukrainians with their linked sensor systems and fire platforms, guns. And by the way, rocket artillery. No, I'm not going to differentiate between the artillery missiles, artillery rockets, and tube artillery. There is a difference, and they have different requirements, but you're still trying to achieve the same basic effect on the enemy. It's just that HIMARS can reach targets with deep pinpoint accuracy, and this is where the Russian way of war encountered the way the Ukrainians were fighting, as Jim described it. More mobile on the battlefield, very mobile in some cases, better linked sensors, and better able to coordinate the fire systems that they have. And I'm including without fire systems, it would be a drone or in limited cases, aircraft to attack ground targets. And interdict supply lines, and drones doing both attack missions and surveillance missions. So they ran into something that they had read about but didn't know the Ukrainians could do. That's maybe a crude and simplistic way of putting it, but I think it describes what we've seen. Being able to, what the Ukrainians can do with being able to pick up the Russian targets. Jim, when I said talked about the longer range systems that it can throw a shell 110 kilometers, that's an interdiction level. It's what it is. That's one of the things it can do. It'll also knock out if you find a headquarters or a storage logger supply logistics point interdicted. It's almost sniping is what it is when you go after a specific target. But if you want to use those expensive shells to deny a supply route, that's deep behind the front lines, and it has one of the effects it can produce. If you've got enough shells that can reach that long, it's an isolation effect. Isolate that you're denying supplies of to the ground forces that are immediately in front of your ground combat forces. So that's one of the other things with the artillery is denying a deep route that up until the arrival of these longer range systems, you were going to have to do it by air or aircraft, manned aircraft, of course, to launch interdiction strikes to isolate the forward edge of the battlefield, to use the military lingo for it. The Russians were not, to get back to your question, the Russians did not accomplish what they claimed they accomplished in modernizing their forces. And the Ukrainians had figured out how they're going to take advantage of all the Russian weaknesses. So it's for a number of reasons, the Russian force couldn't execute what would be considered to be basic combat missions. I guess when I brought up air as well, maybe Jim knows of a Russian strike. I mean, I'm talking about inside Ukraine with strike aircraft, where there were more than 4 or 5. Most of the Russian strike packages I've seen were at most 3 or 4 aircraft. And the way NATO can do it, NATO could coordinate a strike of 600 or 700 F-15s, Typhoons, Tornadoes, F-16s, B-52s, B-1s, whatever you want, F-35s, and that's because of the way the NATO air tasking order works. It takes a lot of work, but you have huge strike packages, and that is something that befuddled me initially, Dan. Why don't the Russians have air supremacy? Well, they can't do some of the sophisticated things that NATO and the Japanese and Korean and Australian air forces can do.
Do you want to wrap up talking about the long-range artillery, Jim?
Yeah, the long-range artillery is basically the guided missiles. And these are getting better. I mean, the United States has just ordered a new batch or 2 new batches of GMLRS, and they have improvements. For example, they have the ability to maneuver as they approach the target, which is a way of disrupting any defenses the Russians may have. The Russians have been able to shoot down some of the GMLRS because they are rather slow moving. They're not supersonic when they approach the target, so that you can target them and you can knock them down. Of course, the Russians also found out that the Patriot system, that the missiles that the Ukrainians have, can even knock down their hypersonic missile. One of those got knocked down as it was trying to hit a target in Kiev. And the United States confirmed that. Of course, there were pieces of the Russian missile all over Kiev, but nothing was hit because it was blown up in the air. So the Russians find themselves constantly on the short end of the stick in terms of tactics and technology, and they just can't seem to catch up. And like I say, I don't think their hearts are into it. This isn't the Great Patriotic War, which they called World War II, where they were defending the homeland. They were attacking somebody else's homeland. And more Russians, even though they in the surveys, they support Russia's effort in the special operation, they understand that, if you get drafted, and a lot of military age men are simply leaving the country, legally or otherwise, that, you're going to be in the position of the Germans in World War II invading Russia. The Russians are going to be fighting, desperately to hang on. And the Germans are basically, at the end of their tether eventually. And so now the Russians, even though they accuse the Ukrainians of being Nazis and et cetera, I mean, sure, a Nazi, that's where the leader is a Jew. They are at a huge disadvantage. They're attacking, they're invading a neighboring country that turned out to be more formidable militarily, man for man, than the Russian forces. They're running out of manpower. They're running out of ideas. And I think a lot of people are running out of patience with Putin. Putin realizes, he's fighting for his political and perhaps his physical, career. Because, if he loses, it's Putin's war. And it doesn't look like he's going to win it right now. And that's become a big topic of conversation in the Russian online, community, which the Russians don't try and suppress because, a lot of them are pro, war. But even the pro-war guys are telling it like it is, and it isn't very pretty.
All right, we'll leave it there, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.